In March 2025, the United States carried out 5 executions across 5 states. In this video, we will break down who these inmates were, the crimes that placed them on death row, and how their final hours unfolded, from last meals to final words. But before we start, let us know in the comment where you're watching this from. This is Verdict Vault. Stay with us. Brad Keith Sigmon. After spending 23 years on death row, Brad Keith Sigmon was executed on March 7th by firing squad in South Carolina, the first such execution in the United States in 15 years. But what did he do to end up there? In the spring of 2001, Brad Keith Sigmon's life spiraled out of control. He was 43 years old. He believed he had lost the only person he ever loved. Rebecca or Becky Lark had ended their relationship. Rebecca moved out of their shared trailer. She moved in with her parents, David and Gladys Lark, who lived right next door. And Sigmon did something that would change everything. On April 27, 2001, he walked into their home. He brought a baseball bat. He bludgeoned both David and Gladys to death. His plan, he later said to police, was chillingly simple. He would kidnap Rebecca. He would force her to spend a weekend with him. He would kill them all, then himself. But Rebecca escaped from his car. She survived. An 11-day manhunt ended in Tennessee, where Sigmon was arrested. He confessed. He pleaded guilty. A Greenville County jury convicted him of 2 counts of murder and first-degree burglary in 2002, sentencing him to death twice over. He also received a 30-year term for the burglary charge. Appeal after appeal failed. State and federal courts denied his challenges. He remained on death row year after year as others around him died and methods of execution changed. For years, lethal injection was the default, but in the early 2020s, South Carolina ran out of drugs and couldn't get more. The result? Executions in the state came to a standstill. Judges refused to sign death warrants unless condemned inmates had a true choice of method. South Carolina law allowed 3 methods: lethal injection, electrocution, and, rarely used, the firing squad. If an inmate made no choice, the electric chair would be used by default. In early 2025, with execution dates being set under a new order, Sigmon had to make a choice. He did something unusual. He rejected lethal injection, not because it was unavailable, but because he feared it. His lawyers argued that recent executions involving pentobarbital had resulted in fluid in the lungs of other inmates, a sign, they said, of a slow, painful death. He rejected the electric chair because he feared he'd be cooked alive. That left only one option: the firing squad. The choice was his. South Carolina law gave it to him, and by choosing it, Sigmon set the stage for a chapter of U.S. legal history. Friday, March 7, 2025. The death chamber was familiar, the same room where dozens of condemned men had waited for their final hour. A white target with a red bullseye was placed over Sigmon's heart. He wore a black jumpsuit. A hood covered his head. 3 South Carolina Department of Corrections volunteers stood 15 feet away, the same distance from the target as the backboard from the free throw line in a basketball court. They carried rifles loaded with ammunition designed to shatter on impact, destroying the heart and causing instantaneous death if the aim was true. At 6:05 p.m., the rifles cracked in unison. The target disappeared in a burst of sound and motion. Witnesses flinched. There was no countdown, just the sudden shock of the shot. For a few seconds, Sigmon breathed heavily. Minutes later, a doctor entered the chamber. At 6:08 p.m., Sigmon was pronounced dead. It lasted less than 3 minutes from the first shot to the official declaration. Sigmon's attorneys released his closing statement. He asked fellow Christians and believers to consider the idea of ending the death penalty. He invoked scripture. He lamented the eye for an eye justification used during his trial. He said, "My closing statement, I want to be one of love." He urged peace. He urged reflection. He wanted others to rethink the very system that brought him here. The execution stirred debate across the country. Critics called the process barbaric and raised questions about giving inmates a choice between methods that some say are all inherently painful or cruel. Supporters argued that all choices under South Carolina law were legal and that Sigmund's case was resolved according to the statute. Jesse Dean Hoffman. After spending 26 years on death row, Jesse Hoffman was executed on March 18th by nitrogen gas in Louisiana. But what did he do to end up there? On November 26, 1996, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a young woman's routine day turned into a nightmare. Mary, or Molly Elliott, 28 years old, an advertising executive, parked in a downtown lot, preparing for work. That day, she encountered Jesse Hoffman Jr., then 18 years old, at his job as a valet attendant. What followed was a violent abduction. Hoffman forced Elliott at gunpoint to withdraw money from an ATM. He then made her drive him out of the city into rural St. Tammany Parish. There, he raped her, and then, at a remote boat launch near the Pearl River, he shot her dead. Her body was found nude and lifeless, the tragic end of a day that began like any other. A jury convicted Hoffman of first-degree murder. On September 11, 1998, he was sentenced to death, a punishment that would hang over him for nearly 27 years. Louisiana hadn't executed a prisoner in more than 15 years. The last state execution had taken place back in 2010. And for years, troubles with lethal injection drugs, shortages, supply issues, and legal challenges made it nearly impossible for the state to carry out capital punishment. In response, Louisiana's Republican-controlled legislature and Governor Jeff Landry approved new execution methods, including nitrogen hypoxia, the use of pure nitrogen gas to induce death by oxygen deprivation. Louisiana became one of only a handful of states to adopt this method. Critics pointed out a stark irony. Nitrogen hypoxia was illegal for euthanizing pets in Louisiana as it became approved for executing human beings. As Hoffman's scheduled execution date of March 18, 2025 approached, lawyers mounted a fierce legal challenge. They argued that nitrogen hypoxia violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They also said it trampled Hoffman's religious rights. For over 2 decades, Hoffman had practiced Buddhism, with breathing and meditation exercises central to his beliefs, practices that the defense argued conflicted with forcing him to breathe pure nitrogen gas. A federal judge in Baton Rouge initially halted the execution, a temporary victory for Hoffman's legal team. But soon after, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit overturned that stay, clearing the way for the execution to proceed. The court ruled that concerns over nitrogen hypoxia did not legally justify blocking the sentence. A final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied, with a closely divided court allowing the execution to move forward. On the evening of March 18, 2025, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, hours ticked down toward the moment history would be made. About 6:21 p.m., Hoffman was strapped to a gurney. A special respirator mask was placed over his face. Pure nitrogen gas, an inert, oxygen-free element, began to flow into the mask. This was not an execution method widely tested. It had only been used 4 times before in the United States, all in Alabama. For 19 minutes, nitrogen replaced the oxygen in Hoffman's lungs. Witnesses reported that he clenched his fists, twitched, and showed signs of bodily movement as the gas flowed, movements that some described afterward with unease. At approximately 6:50 p.m., the coroner pronounced him dead. It was Louisiana's first execution in over a decade. It was also the first time nitrogen gas had been used to kill a human being in the state. Hoffman declined his final meal, and he made no last public statement. Within hours, official responses began to emerge. Governor Landry posted that justice was served, calling the execution necessary to honor the suffering of victims and uphold law and order. "This is what justice looks like in Louisiana." He framed the execution as fulfillment of the state's duty to survivors and victims' families. But not everyone agreed. Hoffman and wife called the execution revenge, not justice, saying her husband was defined by more than his worst moment. And advocates against capital punishment called the use of nitrogen hypoxia cruel, untested, and inconsistent with human dignity.
Wendell Grissom. After spending 17 years on death row, Wendell Grissom was executed on March 20 by lethal injection in Oklahoma. But what did he do to end up there? On November 3, 2005, in Blaine County, Oklahoma, Wendell Grissom and a companion made a choice that would reverberate through years of legal battles. Grissom and Jesse Floyd Johns, then a hitchhiker, were driving west on Interstate 40 when they saw a home along a rural road near Watauga. Inside were 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews, her friend Drew Kopf, and Kopf's two young daughters. They entered the house. At some point, evidence later showed Grissom believed they might obtain what they wanted by force. Shots rang out. Kopf was hit multiple times. She struggled. She begged Grissom to take what he wanted and leave her and the children unharmed. But the violence didn't stop. He chased Matthews into a bedroom where she was trying to protect a child, and he shot her twice in the head, killing her instantly. It would be a crime remembered not just for its brutality, but for how senseless it was. The murder of a young woman in a place that should have been safety, a home with children inside. Grissom and Johns then fled, stealing a vehicle, abandoning it, and eventually being captured not far away. Johns later received a life sentence without parole. Grissom faced far more. At trial, Grissom was convicted of first-degree murder, shooting with intent to kill, grand larceny, and possession of a firearm after a felony conviction. The jury recommended the death penalty. In 2008, a judge formally imposed that sentence. He was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, where he would remain for nearly 17 years before his execution. Over the years that followed, Grissom's legal team repeatedly pressed appeals. They argued that his conviction and sentence should be reconsidered based on evidence never presented at trial, chiefly assessments suggesting significant neurological issues and brain abnormalities. Defense attorneys said Grissom's brain damage affected his impulse control, that older CT and MRI scans showed structural abnormalities, and that jurors should have been informed before deciding his fate. Even 3 jurors from Grissom's original sentencing later said they regretted recommending death after learning about the neurological evidence, telling legal advocates they might have acted differently had they known. But through it all, state courts stood by the conviction and sentence, and in early February 2025, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, after hearing months of argument and testimony, denied clemency in a 4-to-1 vote. The board heard emotional testimony from Grissom's defense attorneys, from survivors, and from those who described how the attack had scarred them physically and psychologically. Attorney General Gentner Drummond spoke in support of the denial, arguing that what Grissom did was cruel and evil, and that justice demanded the sentence be carried out. Without a recommendation for clemency, the governor had no option to block the execution. The path to Grissom's death was clear. The morning of Grissom's execution began like many others at the penitentiary, quietly, with tense preparation inside and watchful eyes from the outside. At 10 a.m., officials brought Wendell Grissom into the execution chamber. He was calm. He was silent. There were no protests, no immediate appeals to last-minute mercy. Witnesses, including members of the Matthews family, survivors such as Drew Kopf, state officials, and reporters, were ushered into viewing areas. Some sat with heavy hearts, others with solemn resolve. Strapped to a gurney, an IV line placed in his arm, Grissom was offered one final chance to speak. He did. In measured words, Grissom apologized. "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt," he said, a rare moment of direct remorse in his final minutes. Then the medical team administered the lethal injection. Officials later said it took 13 minutes for the process to conclude, a relatively brief span in the long timeline of Grissom's case. At 10:13 a.m., the Oklahoma Department of Corrections declared Wendell Grissom dead. Outside the prison walls, reactions were starkly divided as the decades-long debates around capital punishment itself. For survivors and the family of Amber Matthews, the execution marked a long-awaited conclusion, a moment of closure, bittersweet and incomplete. Drew Kopf, who had been shot multiple times and narrowly escaped with her life, had lived the intervening years with the physical and emotional aftermath of that night. Her testimony during the clemency hearing detailed how the attack changed her life, how bullet fragments remain in her body, how every unexpected doorbell can trigger a panic, how fear stayed with her long after the crime.
Aaron Gunches. After spending 17 years on death row, Aaron Gunches was executed on March 19th by lethal injection in Arizona. But what did he do to end up there? On a cold night in November 2002 in Mesa, Arizona, Ted Price, age 40, arrived at the home of his ex-girlfriend, Catherine Letcher. He had driven from Utah, hoping to collect a student grant check and begin a new chapter. Instead, his life would end in violence and desert sand. Earlier that evening, Price and Letcher had argued. In the heat of the moment, she struck him with the telephone, leaving him dazed and injured. Later, Aaron Gunches, Letcher's then-boyfriend and friend of the group, arrived home to find Price there. He berated him, pulled a gun, and ordered that Price be put in a car with his belongings. One of the women drove, but instead of a bus station, the car took a long turn into the Arizona desert, past paved roads and signs of civilization, out toward the Beeline Highway and a spot where few travelers pass. There, Gunches forced Price out of the car. Moments later, he shot him 4 times, 3 in the chest and once in the head. Price fell, lifeless, into the dry dirt. Price's body would not be found for nearly a month, and Gunches would not be arrested for almost 2 months after a separate incident in which he shot at a state trooper during a routine traffic stop. He survived, but the shooting led law enforcement on a manhunt that ended with his capture. Unlike many death row inmates who exhaust every legal avenue to delay execution, Aaron Gunches did the opposite. In 2004, he was charged with first-degree murder and other crimes relating to Price's death. In 2007, he pleaded guilty, waived counsel, and chose to represent himself, a decision a judge once described as suicide by jury. His jury returned a death sentence in 2008. After an automatic appeal, the Arizona Supreme Court vacated that sentence, noting technical issues with how aggravating factors were applied. But on retrial in 2013, another jury again imposed a death sentence. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld that sentence in 2016. From that point on, Gunches did something unusual. He refused to file typical appeals. He repeatedly wrote to courts asking to speed up his execution. In letters to the state Supreme Court, he urged officials to not delay, saying the sentence was long overdue and that the law should be followed. At times, he even waived his right to a clemency hearing. He became what advocates and reporters called a volunteer, a death row inmate who seeks to hasten his own death by handing over control of the appeals process. This decision would shape not only the case's outcome, but also how Arizona would resume carrying out death sentences after years without doing so. By the early 2020s, Arizona had paused executions. The state's last execution had taken place more than 2 years earlier, in 2022. Officials cited concerns about lethal injection protocols, transparency in drug sourcing, and the aftermath of past botched executions, including one in 2014 where the condemned man gasped for hours before dying.
Debate swirled around the legality and ethics of where and how lethal injection drugs were obtained, with critics urging more public scrutiny and better procedures. Under a new warrant from the Arizona Supreme Court issued in February 2025, and with Gunch's consent, the state set an execution date for March 19, 2025, a moment that would mark a shift in Arizona's death penalty landscape. At 10:02 a.m., guards brought Aaron Gunches into the execution chamber at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. 5 correction staff escorted him, and he climbed onto the gurney, the medical table designed for the state's gravest duty. Restraints were secured. White-suited medical personnel inserted intravenous lines into both arms. Gunches lay still. He did not speak. When asked if he had any final words, he shook his head. There would be no final appeal to those gathered. By 10:14 a.m., the lethal injection process began. Medical staff administered pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate used in executions across the United States.
Witnesses reported that Gunches breathed heavily at first, exhaled deeply several times, and then grew still as consciousness faded. Minutes later, at 10:33 a.m., the Arizona Department of Corrections declared him dead. His execution had taken place without any procedural interruption. According to officials, it went according to plan and without incident. Family members of Ted Price were present, including his sister, Karen Price. She had lived with the uncertainty of her brother's disappearance and violent death for more than 2 decades. At a news briefing following the execution, Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, who had supported finally carrying out the sentence, said the family deserved closure. Price's sister said the legal process had been long and painful, that justice had not undone the tragedy of losing a loved one, but that this day marked a final chapter in the system's response.
Edward Thomas James. After spending 31 years on death row, Edward Thomas James was executed on March 20th by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do to end up there? On September 19, 1993, in Castleberry, Florida, 2 lives were taken in a crime that stunned the neighborhood and left a family shattered forever. That night, Edward Thomas James, then 32 years old, was staying in a room at the home of Betty Dick, 58, where her 8-year-old granddaughter, Toni Neuner, was also staying. Within hours, both would be dead. According to court records and reporting, James had consumed significant amounts of alcohol and used drugs before the violence erupted. He strangled Toni Neuner, brutally raping her before killing her. He then stabbed Betty Dick to death, turning a place of safety into a scene of unimaginable horror. After the murders, James stole Dick's jewelry and her car, leaving Florida and traveling across the country. For weeks, he remained on the run, selling the stolen items as he evaded law enforcement. His capture came after authorities broadcast his description on America's Most Wanted, a rare collaboration between investigators and national media that ultimately brought him to justice. He was arrested on October 6, 1993, in Bakersfield, California, found with Dick's car in his possession. A videotaped confession sealed his fate. In the mid-1990s, James stood before a Florida jury on multiple charges: first-degree murder ×2, attempted sexual battery, aggravated child abuse, kidnapping, grand theft auto, and other theft charges. He pleaded guilty to the murders and other charges, a plea that reflected the overwhelming evidence against him. He also entered no contest to several related charges. In 1995, the jury recommended a death sentence under Florida law. The judge agreed. James was condemned to die. But there was a complication. His jury's recommendation was non-unanimous, an 11-to-1 vote, a detail that decades later would form a significant legal argument in his final appeals. For years, James's attorneys fought in state and federal courts.
They argued that his conviction and sentence were flawed, that constitutional protections were overlooked, and that newly discovered medical and psychological evidence should stay his execution. One notable claim was that James had suffered cognitive decline over many years in prison, including after a serious heart attack in 2023 that left him without a pulse for nearly 20 minutes, potentially depriving his brain of oxygen. His legal team presented evidence of memory loss, seizures, and dementia stemming from years of substance abuse and health issues. They petitioned courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to issue stays of execution, arguing that he might not fully understand the nature and implications of his sentence due to his mental state. But each bid failed. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied his application to delay his execution, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld the decision not to reconsider his Eighth Amendment and competency claims. A final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court came just hours before the scheduled execution, but it too was refused, clearing the way for the sentence to be carried out. On a Thursday evening in March 2025, at the Florida State Prison near Stark, the long wait came to an end. Under a death warrant signed by Governor Ron DeSantis, James was brought to the execution chamber at approximately 6 p.m. EST. Witnesses, including members of law enforcement, corrections officials, and a handful of family members of the victims, took their places in the viewing areas. Some came seeking closure, others braced for a moment they called justice finally served. James declined to give a final statement. He offered no last words. At 8:15 p.m., after a brief delay that Florida officials did not immediately explain, the lethal injection process began. 3 drugs were administered: a sedative, a paralytic, and a drug to stop the heart, the protocol Florida has used in executions for decades. Witnesses described the scenes as somber and motionless. James breathed heavily at first, his arms flinched, and then his body grew still. Shortly after, the corrections officials pronounced him dead, the sentence finally carried out after nearly 30 years on death row. Outside the prison, reactions were mixed, as they often are with capital punishment. Family members of the victims expressed that the execution brought a form of accountability they had sought for decades. Tony Neuner's brother, Jared Pearson, said the family had found some kind of peace with the process, but he also acknowledged the irreparable loss inflicted that night in 1993. "It's all pure evil," Pearson said, referring to James's crimes and their aftermath. But opponents of the capital punishment gathered as well, holding signs outside the prison. Many argued that executing James, a man with serious health and cognitive issues, was unnecessary, and that life imprisonment might better reflect both punishment and humanity. Advocates raised concerns about Florida's lethal injection protocols, which have been challenged as potentially causing severe pain, a claim that civil rights groups say violates the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment.
At this point, we've seen 3 different execution methods: firing squad, nitrogen gas, and lethal injection, each defended as humane and each deeply controversial. Which one disturbed you the most and why? Let us know in the comments. If you're new here, subscribe, because every story on this channel is built on court records, verified reporting, and the voices of those left behind. Thank you for watching Verdict Vault. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay compassionate, and keep seeking the truth.